Welcome back to another amazing coffee conversation. Today, we're going to be diving into the spiritual pathway to healing anxiety. And I'm joined, as always, with the lovely Christine Renee today. And we're both really excited about this topic because anxiety and working through anxiety from a spiritual perspective is something that we both have a lot of personal and professional experience with. And so I'm hoping that in today's conversation, we can bring you guys some insight and inspiration so that if you're someone who experiences anxiety, whether that's a regular daily part of your existence or it's just an every now and then kind of thing, that if you experience anxiety, you walk away from today feeling like there's hope, like you don't have to be stuck in it, like you don't have to live according to your body's anxiety cycles is my goal for today. And so we're hoping to take you guys through the spiritual pathway to healing anxiety. And along the way, we'll talk about the shamanic perspective of anxiety, how you can look at anxiety through the chakras, and so much more. So without further ado, Christine, do you want to dive in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things I love to preface this conversation with is that a lot of people experience anxiety in a lot of different ways, right? And I think if you would have asked me what anxiety was 5 years ago, I would probably have a very different answer because it was very specific to how I experience anxiety, which is very root chakra based. It's like a survival thing, money mindset thing, right? Versus other people are having panic attacks and they're feeling in their heart chakra. And so I want to just start off the conversation with anxiety shows up in a lot of different ways and it affects our lives in a lot of different ways. And so coming to the point of going, anxiety is really individualistic and it can really show up in ways that are going to be most triggering for you, like someone else's anxiety. When I hear about things going on in their life, I'm like, that doesn't cause me anxiety at all, right? But the idea of me going camping and me having enough food for the weekend, that gives me an incredible amount of anxiety, right? So recognizing that it's going to look different for different people and knowing that that's okay. Like it doesn't, like a lot of times we try to cover this anxiety conversation and try to pigeonhole people into one type of anxiety or one way it shows up. And over the years, and with myself and Isabel, as well as many students and clients who have worked through anxiety, we know that it shows up in a lot of freaking different ways. So I just want to put that out there right from the beginning. And then the question is really, what is anxiety? Anxiety is this emotional reaction to something that we're worried about, something that's causing us concern. And it really affects our nervous system. So our nervous system is heading into that fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode because of the situation at hand. Whether that's something imminent that's causing anxiety or it's something that's way out in the future. Typically, anxiety is worry about something that's coming. You're anticipatory around the thing that's coming towards you in time. So keep that in mind as we look at this conversation from many different angles.
And something that I'd love to add to that is kind of two things that I think are really important for having that kind of really holistic perspective of anxiety is a lot of times that fear of what's coming in the future, this anticipatory, nervous feeling of what's coming in the future is often rooted in the past. And the way that I like to explain this is if you look at, a baby, a child, a very young toddler, right? They're not scared of something until they have an experience that tells them that that thing is something to be afraid of. They come into this world with that level of innocence, right? And then let's say that they're riding on one of those little walkers that babies have. I did this once. I was running around on my walker and I ran smack into a corner in the wall, and I actually still have a dent in my forehead. I hit the wall so hard. And from that moment on, I had a lot of anxiety going around corners in my walker as a child. And it wasn't because I had that before. It was because I had had an inciting incident that told me this is now something to be anxious about. This is something that you can cause you fear because you have experience in the past that says that it should be a fearful experience. And so this, I think, is going to be really key when we're talking about healing anxiety later on, because it means that there's something in our past that we've already experienced that tells us that something in the future is not okay. It's a reflection of the past projected into the future. And we'll come back to that because it's really important. But I think having that understanding is really key for knowing what anxiety is. And I think the other piece of it is, for me, I also like to look at anxiety as almost like spiritual friction. It's the moments where your mind has one story and your soul or your spirit has another, and they're just kind of playing tug of war back and forth. Like your soul knows that you're safe, that you're okay, that you're enough, that you're loved, and your mind is over here going, but I'm not, but I'm not, but I'm not, but I'm not. Or what if, what if, what if, what if? And so you just get this back and forth tug of war. And that's what causes that anxiety, and that's what causes that nervous system reaction, because you're actually experiencing this energetic friction inside of yourself of tugging back and forth, not sure which reality is the right one to choose. And I think that's part of why anxiety can feel so all-consuming in the moment for a lot of people, is that you can't tell a lot of times when you're in the middle of an anxious feeling, you can't tell which reality is the one that you're quote unquote supposed to choose, right? Your mind is saying that this is something to be afraid of. This is dangerous. You shouldn't do this. It's not okay. And your soul's going, you're okay. You're okay. You're okay. And it's like you have these two minds. You're literally of two minds. That cognitive dissonance has you stuck because you cannot tell which path to choose. And so part of this idea of taking a spiritual path to heal anxiety is developing that trust in our intuition and that trust in our soul, because in that moment, even if our mind is saying one thing and our soul is saying another, if at the bottom of it all we have a foundation of trust in the universe, trust in the divine, trust in our souls, trust in ourselves, we know that even if our brain is saying something different, we can still trust the story that our soul is telling us. And sometimes even just that awareness of, I see the mind story, I see the soul story, and I can choose which one I want to follow. And I know that in the past, my soul has never led me astray. Even that can be enough to kind of rewire the pathway, but it is a process. And so I think having that awareness as well of this idea of anxiety as that spiritual tug of war, that spiritual friction, can be really helpful, because it can help you to see that it's not just one storyline that you're stuck in. It's the fact that there's two different options and your brain doesn't know which one to choose. And I think that's really important.
And I think with that too, so often I see clients that they only are listening to their mind. They're only listening to their mind. Their soul doesn't have the volume turned up to have the individual even hear it. And so sometimes it's not going to be a one and done session, because we're having to train the individual how to part the weeds and all of the busyness of their mind and the overactive anxiety to even be able to listen to the soul's voice. And I think that is something to be aware of as well, that oftentimes we give so much power and recognition to the mind that we're not even aware of that second voice. And so when we have someone who's, really in that label, that diagnosis of I have anxiety, it takes quite a bit of like, let's clear this, let's clear this, let's clear this, so that we can actually like, okay, now what is your higher self, the grandest version of you, who you are, what's their voice telling you? And they're like, oh my God, I've never heard that before. So if we're talking a foreign language, know that that is a possibility that, we need to kind of clear out some of the mind space. And we're so conditioned in our culture to not give that part of ourselves a voice and to allow it to trust it, that it can get some time to get there. And that is okay, because what if life was without anxiety? I'm like, just if we can settle into like, what if this beautiful possibility can exist, right? And so this is kind of that what if up game. We're kind of flopping it over, because oftentimes our bodies, our minds are playing the what if down. Like, what if shit hits the fan? What if my finances don't work out? What if I lose my house? What if I lose custody of my child? What if, and it's all negative. And one of the best things that we can do to really turn our conscious awareness away from that pattern is playing the what if up game. What if it all worked out for my behalf? What if I get exactly what I wanted? What if today was a great day and I get 3 new clients? What if, like, how can we orchestrate our mind to optimism and to trusting, like, all right, I'm going to put this out there and I'm going to see how the universe wants to show up for it. And so in the beginning, it might just show up in like angel numbers, and you see all of these numbers showing up in your life, and it's just giving you confidence. Okay, a bigger divine source is paying attention to me. I'm getting signs. Like, it's just those first baby steps that are really important to know that you are not alone in this game of life, right? And I think that is so key to helping us switch out of our anxiety, is having this trust in a bigger source, whatever you want to call it, divine, God, creator, whatever that is for you. But when we know that things are showing up for reason and purpose, and that we can learn from the events that are showing up and getting curious about why they're showing up, the exploration becomes easier, and we're able to tune down that logical mind anxiety level.
And I think on that note of what you were talking to a little bit earlier, of this idea of clients only listening to the mind, I think that's something that's really key, especially when we're first working through anxiety, or we're first taking those steps to say, you know what, no, I don't want this to be my experience, right? I want to experience something more. I want to be able to, right? If you're listening to Christine talk about these what if ups and you're going, oh, I can't even do that. If you want to be able to get to that point where thinking to yourself, what if it did work out, doesn't in itself cause anxiety, right? Because that's often an experience that people have, is they hear that and they go, oh, but I can't do that because the mind is so afraid of something new. If we're still so stuck in that tight-fisted anxiety, whatever that looks like or however that presents for you, something that I think is really, really important that I was actually working with a client on the other day is this idea of coming to an understanding that not everything that comes into your head is real. And so what I mean by this, I'm going to kind of give a little bit of my client's background because I think it helps illustrate this point. She was working through one of her beloved pets, her cat, who was also her spirit guide, was passing over. She was very, very connected to this cat. She'd had him for years, and it was finally his time to go. And she was having a really, really hard time, and it was bringing up all kinds of anxiety. Loss and abandonment is a big trigger for her. And so it was bringing up all of this anxiety, and she was sending me voice message after voice message about all of these emotions, right? Because it's so important to be able to acknowledge the emotions and acknowledge the anxiety that we're having. And at the end of it, we got to the end, and I was like, what if there was nothing to fix? What if there was nothing to change? What if you're not doing anything wrong? What if your mind can have this emotion and still be okay? This knowledge that both can be true, that if your mind says the world is ending, or your life is going to fall apart, or this person's going to leave, or this anxiety is going to come true, that just because your mind has that thought doesn't make it true. It doesn't mean that that's actually what's going to happen. It doesn't mean that if you feel like it's your problem and you have to fix it or everything's going to fall apart, it doesn't mean you actually have to fix it. All it means is that your mind is having a response to a neural connection in your brain that was made at some point in your past. That's all an anxious thought is. It's a trigger that your mind is bringing up because at some point in the past, something similar happened, and your brain is saying, oh, I know how this goes. I'm just going to spring load you this way so we can skip over everything, right? Basically, what anxiety is trying to do is it's your brain trying to get you to skip over the important things just to get to the end, right? And if we're really committed to living a spiritual path and embracing that spiritual or Reiki lifestyle of being led by the divine, of being trusting that we're here for a reason and a purpose, like Christine was saying, we have to also trust that those experiences are important, that we're here to experience life. And so we can recognize that this is just my brain wanting to skip over the good part because it doesn't think there's anything good there. And it's like, what if that, here we go again with the what ifs. What if that moment that your brain wants to skip over is actually where you're going to learn something, where you're going to make a new friend, where you're going to have a new experience, where you're going to get an inspiration, right? And so we can kind of take this dual pathway to looking at what the brain is doing and say that it's just your mind. One of my favorite things I love to tell clients is your mind is like a toddler, right? If you tell it can't have a piece of candy that it wants, it's going to throw a fit, right? But you, as the adult in this scenario, know that maybe that candy has something bad in it that the child is allergic to. And you have to be able to say, it's for your greatest and highest good to not have that right now, or to not do that right now. Or we're going to leave the store because that's what's for your greatest and highest good, because you have that perspective. And that relationship is very similar to what we have with the divine, where the divine knows what's for our greatest and highest good. It knows what we need and what we don't need. And our brains are like that little toddler just throwing a hissy fit when things don't go the way that it thinks it should go. And so when we can recognize that, when we can recognize that our brain just has a very limited number of pathways through which it can see the world, right? Our brain is just a blueprint of our past. It has a very limited number of ways that it can perceive what's happening in the world around us. If we can look at that and we can say, I have a mind that has all these limited perspectives, right? It's doing the best it can, but it has all these limited perspectives. And I have the divine that can see all of me, that knows the greater and higher purpose, that has that expansive perception. I can trust that my mind can throw its fit. It can have these thoughts. It can say everything's going to go wrong, and that the divine has a different plan in store, that there's something else here that I'm not seeing in this moment because my mind is stuck in its small perspectives. And so part of walking the path to anxiety, I think, is understanding that sometimes you just have to let the mind throw its fit and not get attached to it. Like, let it think the thoughts, let it be scared, let it have anxiety, let it be afraid. It's okay. It's okay to have anxiety. It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to wonder if everything's going to fall apart. As long as you understand that just because that thought is in your head doesn't make it true, that there's a different, greater truth that you can connect with and you can step into. And so when we're thinking about that, this is where this next piece of what we're talking about, this idea of what if up, or expanding, or trusting in the divine, or connecting to that other voice that you have inside you, this is where I think it's also really important to understand that the work of healing anxiety doesn't happen when you're anxious. I think a lot of times people want to heal their anxiety when they're in the middle of an anxious phase or an anxious episode or in the middle of a panic attack. And it's like, that's not when the healing's going to happen. And so often what happens is we think we're doing fine. We don't think about it. And then anxiety shows up for us, however that looks, right? Maybe it's a panic attack. Maybe it's physiological reactions. Maybe it's just your brain gets stuck in this one pathway and it can't let it go. Anxiety shows up. And then you're like, oh man, I could do better. And you're trying to pull yourself out and pull yourself out and pull yourself out. But guess what? When your brain is stuck on that pathway and you're trying to pull yourself out, you're just adding to that spiritual friction that we were talking about earlier. And it's just going to make things worse, which is why having the ability to just let your mind ride, let it play out its scenario, let it be anxious, and hook into this idea that there's something more. There's a broader perspective that you're not seeing. There's a bigger way of viewing the situation than your mind is. Let yourself work through that. And then when you're out of it, the next day, the next week, the next month, when you're calm again, that's when the work of healing anxiety actually happens. Because a lot of times, if we're trying to heal it in the middle, we get frustrated and we give up. And then we just repeat the cycle and repeat the cycle and repeat the cycle. But if we take those moments when we're feeling calm, when we're feeling centered, and we say, okay, what was the trigger? What started that anxious reaction for me? How is that connected to something that I've experienced in my past? Where's the root of that trigger? What's the limiting belief? What's the I am statement at the bottom of that trigger that caused all of this anxiety to come up? And we do the work of healing those past wounds and rewiring those neural networks. That's what's going to allow you to experience anxiety differently, or to release anxiety, or to move through it in a more efficient and less attached way. It doesn't happen when you're anxious. It happens in the day-to-day moments when you're outside of that state, and you can walk that path and you can undo those pathways without adding to that friction because you're already in that grounded state.
And so with that, knowing that if you are just constantly in the cycle, this is a really good point in which to get a counselor, get a coach, get someone to help support you. Because when anxiety is at its absolute worst, we're going into a point of despair. Like you can't see the option. You can't even think or fathom there's a bigger, higher purpose in all of this. Like that's, if that is hard, know that it is okay to reach out for help. Like whether you were coming in for Reiki coaching, whether you have a counselor who's going to help you work through it, like it's okay to get and receive the support that you need. And so knowing that is always a really beautiful option if that quiet, grounded spaces are really hard to find tangible in your life, right? Because so much of this is like, how do we break the cycle? How do we stop the constant anxiety, the constant worry, the constant. And for me, like recognizing, crap, I'm in a state of anxiety. Like that's the first step. Like the first step is just to have the awareness, like, okay, this is where I'm at. This is that underlying feeling. Because for me, it's like, it's not overt. It's not obvious when I'm in a state of anxiety. Mine is really like, and it's been this way almost my whole life. And it's very in my family. Like my sister is an anxious person. My mom has signs of anxiety. My daughter has huge anxiety issues. So like, it's part of like my genetic coding, if you will. And my first recognition is like, how am I distracting myself? Am I on Facebook watching reels all day? Am I refusing to actually attend to my dishes and the everyday chores? Like, am I just letting things pile up? Am I like, how am I like basically self-sabotaging because all I want to do is zone out? It's not like I'm trying to zone out so I don't hear my mind and its anxious worry. But in that way, I'm also just getting stuck. I'm just making myself stuck, and it's all going to get worse because now I'm going to get anxious over the freaking dishes and the laundry that's not folded and all the things that the to-do list is getting longer as I freaking just want to shelter on the couch. Right? So know that even to the best of us who have a lot of these skill sets, it happens. And to be able to reach out and be like, yo, Isabel, use this session right now because something is off. Like, I don't even know what it is, but I need help. Like, that's okay. And I'm at the point too where I see the signs, I see what's happening. I see that I'm scrolling. I see the dishes piling up. I see the laundry that's not folded. I see the things that are my sign that like, okay, I'm actually self-sabotaging in this moment and going, okay, time out, take a breath. What is actually going on? What's the fear here? Where's the anxiety at? And can I see what I'm afraid of and going, it's actually not that scary. It is scary. It's freaking scary. It's always going to be scary. Your mind is going to think it's like the worst case scenario. And at the end of the day, like when we can actually ravel it back and go, what am I actually most afraid of? I'm afraid that someone's not going to like, people aren't going to accept me. People aren't going to love me. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going like, I'm a very public out there company, right? Like Reiki Cafe has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. Like we just hit 6,500 people over on YouTube. Thank you, all of our YouTube listeners out there. And going, what if? And then I have to remind myself, I can breathe. I can come back to my breath and going, worst case scenario is someone's upset, but that's not me. That's not me. That is their stuff. So if this conversation is triggering to you, that's your stuff that you need to look at and work on. And you know what? That's my soul's purpose, which is why it gets uncomfortable. My soul's purpose is really to push other people's buttons and to let them feel uncomfortable so that they can identify and do the healing work that they need to do. Right. And so recognizing what is it about me in this pattern that's making me small. I'm making myself small so the world can't see me. So it's a self-protection mechanism. So I'm going to stay in the small cycle. And as soon as I go, crap, I'm in that small cycle again. Because when I'm in that small cycle, I'm not open and available for divine intervention. I'm not open and available for expansion. And so I have to catch it, and I have to do the things that are going to help me, whether that's delete the freaking Facebook app off of my phone, or it's I need to go talk to someone. I need to go for a walk. I need to spend time in my garden. I need to do these things that fill up my cup. I need to take an Epsom salt bath. I need to go to some type of ceremony or spiritual event to kind of help me adjust my energy. I need to go to a somatic breathwork class. Like, I'm going to go, okay, here I am. I'm stuck. I'm in the cycle. And what do I need to do to break out of it? And for me, sometimes that's just hiring the freaking help. Like, I don't like to do chores. I think that's so ridiculous, but I will trade any day to do a Reiki session for someone to come in and clean my house. Like, that's me, right? Like, and so it's very much of going, where are you at? What do you need to do to fill up your cup? That's going to be supportive, and what's going to help break the cycle of your mind.
And I think that's such an important part here, is understanding that even through all of this conversation and all of the things that we're sharing with you, it really comes down to, what does it look like for you? What's going to help you move through those things? And knowing that that cycle might shift, right? So 3 years ago for me, I was very much dealing with some pretty severe PTSD. And my anxiety state in that year is very, very different than how my anxiety happens today. But it was through that process of what Christina's saying, being able to identify, okay, what does anxiety look like for me? What are my first indicators that I am anxious? When do I know that something is off and I need to reconnect? I shared in a past podcast that idea of reconnecting the wires, this idea of, I have my mind and I have my soul. Where are they disconnected? Where is that spiritual friction happening? And so for me now, I have this process that I go through when I can tell I'm feeling anxious. And oftentimes, my first sign that I'm anxious is I feel a little detached from everything. I just feel a little bit like I'm kind of up in my crown. My favorite go-to protection mechanism is to disassociate. I'm really good at just popping out of my body. And in that year where I was in a really intense PTSD response, I would be gone before I even noticed, to the point where, like, I would look at my hand and not realize that it was my hand gone. I've practiced and gone through that process to now it's like I just feel a little bit lifted up. Like there's like an inch of space below my tailbone if I'm sitting down. I'm just not quite here, or my chest starts to feel tight, or I notice that my breathing's a little shallow. And so for me, it's that first realization of, oh, I'm trying not to be here right now. There's something that my mind is like, it'd be easier if we just left for a little bit. And so then we take those 3 deep breaths. There's a lot of really beautiful research out there that even just 3 deep breaths is enough to switch you into that rest and digest state of your nervous system. Just 3 intentional deep breaths is all it takes. And so I take my 3 deep breaths, and then I go through and I think, okay, when did I start feeling this way? Today, what started me feeling a little bit anxious today? And then I notice, okay, I was sitting on the couch and my fiance said this thing. And that's when I started to feel that feeling. Then it's like, okay, what about that phrase didn't sit right? What did that bring up in me? What was that triggering? Where is that coming from? Why are those collection of words something that my mind is shrinking away from? And then I can follow that back until I can realize, oh, maybe it was that this thing that he said made me feel like I'm not enough, that I'm a disappointment, that whatever it is, right? We can walk it back and reconnect those wires until we get back to that limiting belief or that core inciting incident that we were talking about earlier. Because I think that's the other thing, is a lot of, I think you could almost say all anxiety has a root in some kind of limiting belief about yourself. It is always rooted in an I'm not enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not safe, I'm not gonna make it, I'm not, whatever it is. There's an I am limiting belief statement. And so if you can walk it back and find what that is, my next step for me to walk through that anxious process is to let that feeling come up. Because right? When you hit that limiting belief that's being pushed on, because that emotion comes up. And so then I let myself feel that emotion. I let it process. And then I go back to my breathing. And I go back to whatever it is that day that's going to help me realign with myself. Maybe it's taking deep breaths. Maybe it's doing some Reiki. Maybe it's going for a walk. Like Christine was saying, what's that thing that's going to help me realign? That's going to help me come back into my center so that I can settle in. And part of doing this process is being able to realize, is now a moment where you just let it do its thing and fizzle out? Or is now a moment where you face it and you work through it? Because not every anxious moment is a moment to go, why am I feeling this way? And so you have to be able to notice, is this a time to calm and self-soothe in an intentional, healthy way? Or is now a time that it's going to be helpful for me to say, what's coming up right now? Can I heal this? And so those are very different states of anxiety. I think when you are constantly stuck in that cycle of negative self-talk or really intense anxiety, a lot of times it's making the conscious choice to use healthy coping mechanisms instead of destructive coping mechanisms, because it's often just that little switch from self-sabotage or scrolling on Instagram or overeating or overworking. That's my big one. Am I working like 16 hours today? I'm probably a little anxious about something that I don't want to look at, right? Like looking at this negative self-sabotaging behavior and instead saying, okay, I recognize that I'm anxious. I recognize that something's not right. And I don't have the emotional capacity right now to try and figure out what it is. This is a time where I just need to shift states. I need to get a little more grounded. I need to feel more calm. Can I choose to step away from the negative coping behavior and find a positive coping behavior? Can I make myself a cup of tea instead of reaching for that can of soda? Can I go journal instead of working so that my mind still feels like it's doing something, but it's helping me process? Can I go for a walk outside and take some deep breaths instead of just scrolling on Instagram? Can I find a healthy equivalent of that coping mechanism to help bring me back to center and to breathe a little bit? And then when you're feeling more grounded and you feel like you have the capacity, going through that cycle, because the other part of it is, like Christine was saying, when we can go through that work, right? Whenever that is for you, whether it's while you're anxious or it's later on, like we were talking about, when you have the ability and the capability to be in that space, even if being in that space means that there's a counselor holding that space for you, that there's a Reiki practitioner like Christine or myself holding space for you. When you're in a space where you can work through that, the ability to look at that and say, there's something at the root of this in me that's getting triggered. This is my story, my wound, my I am statement that's coming up. And when we can understand that, healing almost becomes a little bit selfish, I want to say. Like, we have to be willing to understand that all of our triggers, all of our emotions, all of our experiences are rooted in our experiences, in our beliefs, in our understanding of how the world works. And so when we are feeling triggered, when we're feeling stressed, it's because something in us is triggered. And likewise, when someone else is feeling anxious, angry, sad, judgmental, triggered, etc., it's because something in them is being triggered. And so when we say that, well, that's their thing, we're not saying it in like an egotistical, well, I'm healed and they're not. We're saying it in like a general, honest, almost like a reflection of namaste, right? Like that idea of, I understand that my triggers are a reflection of a wound in me, just like your triggers are a reflection of a wound in you. And so by healing ourselves, by saying, okay, I'm not going to worry about what they're thinking, saying, feeling, judging, whatever, because it's not about me. But I am going to come back to what in me was triggered, what in me was anxious, what in me does need healed, and work through that. We're then giving that person permission to do the same thing. And it just starts to unfold bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's this process of letting yourself understand that it is all rooted in the self. It's all rooted in our stories about ourselves. And that's not a selfish or egotistical perspective. That's just pure psychology. That's just how our minds work. And we have to be able to go in and find those stories and rewire the thoughts enough that, like Christine was saying, we can create that space for divine intervention to come through. We can create the space for us to hear that other voice, to connect to our soul, to connect to our intuition. But if we're so caught up in that mind story, there's not going to be any space for that. And so it is this process of kind of figuring out which level, which layer of anxiety are you in? Are you in that really deep level where you just need to choose a healthier coping mechanism for now? Are you in that slightly less deep level where you can do some of that work and look at, okay, what's being triggered? What's the story? What can I heal? Are you in that space where you can say, okay, yeah, there's some anxiety, but there's also the divine. There's also the soul. There's also this. There's so many different pathways that you can take, but it all starts with allowing yourself to be where you are with your anxiety instead of wishing that, oh, I just wish that I could, flip the switch and the divine would be there. Like, yeah, that would be great, right? And they are there, but we have to go through that process to be able to open up, and that's okay. Letting yourself go through that process. And one of the things that I think people ask the most often in healing anxiety is, well, how? How do you do that? How do you go through the process? How do you let yourself feel? How do you find the coping mechanism? And I will never forget when I was really deep in my PTSD, like very much struggling in a terrible mental place. I asked my mom that question. I was like, how do you do it? And she looked at me and she said, you just do. And I was so mad at that answer at the time. I was like, that is the worst piece of advice you could have possibly given me. Just do it. But it's true. At a certain point, you have to stop thinking about how you're going to heal, and you have to just heal. You have to just take the step. It might be the wrong one. It might tell you, oh, you know what? Next time I'll do this instead. It might not lead to where you want it to go, but you have to do something. Part of anxiety is we get stuck in the cycle of thinking and we're not doing anything. And at a certain point, you just have to let yourself do it, because it's that action step, it's that choice, it's choosing something different than what you've been doing that's going to open up the next step and the next step and the next step. And that step, that moment to moment work is that pathway through anxiety.
Yeah. And it's kind of like this very much, I'm going to cancel what I've been doing. So whatever that looks like for you, like how can you cancel that? Cancel the mind subscription to the negative limiting beliefs. How can you go, okay, I'm not going to think that anymore. And then you think it, and then you go, okay, now I've got to replace that thought. So you start thought catching. One of my favorite things is to put myself in the energy of what I would like to be experiencing. So whether that is through self-care, but my favorite thing is to tune into a podcast that is the language that I is speaking to my soul, right? So Hello Reiki Cafe is a great choice, Reiki Cafe Radio. Like I want to listen to things that are going to encourage my soul's voice to come out stronger. Right. And so one of my favorite ones is like, I was listening to Amanda Francis the other day, and her main message is like, you can't fuck it up. You can't fuck it up. And I'm like, I love this. I love this piece of you can do things, but it's all going to be supported because the universe has your back. Like everything that happens, you can't fuck it up. Like just do the things and you can't fuck it up. And if you live life, like that was what my higher self, my soul's voice needed to hear, to go, you know what? I can't mess this thing called life up. I can't mess it up. But if I want to live to my life to the fullest, how do I need to trust that? Trust that I'm just going to keep showing up. I'm going to keep doing the work. I'm going to keep doing the things that if I make people upset, like that's on them. And I'm going, if I can start living my life in a way that's allowing in the ease and flow. And I think that's the other piece. I recently had a conversation with a good friend and I was just like, well, I think like I don't have any other big pieces of healing to work on. Like I put myself in situations to do the healing work, and nothing big is showing up because I've worked through so much over the last 10 years. And to go, at what point can you just say it's allowed to be easy? It's allowed to be flow. It's okay to have a good life. It doesn't always have to be hard. It doesn't always have to be murky. It doesn't always have to be crunchy. And to know that like it does get easier, and going, I choose a life that's easier and in flow. And when there's a lesson, I'm going to be able to pause sooner and recognize what's going on so I can get the help and support to change my frequency and energy quicker. Right. Like, I think that we need to remember that the goal isn't to be in your healing, like the hardness of your healing phase for your whole life. We all have healing work to do, including myself. We all have healing work to do, but there is those seasons of your life that you can say, yeah, it gets to be easy now. It gets to be in flow and it gets to feel good. And to say yes to that, to know that that's available. And if I keep playing out those negative scenarios, I'm never going to be able to get into my ease and flow.
And I think there's something to that of, I was talking with a client the other day about this idea of, well, if I'm anxious, am I just causing my life to be bad? Right? This is a mindset that is really prevalent in the spiritual community right now. And I'm like, I want to delete that one. Like if I could vote one spiritual belief off the island, it would be that one. Because it's like that's not quite how it works. There's not a question of fault here. It's not that you're choosing to stay in this anxious cycle and so therefore your life is falling apart. That's not how any of this works, right? It's that our energy is constantly cycling with what's happening outside of us. The external energy is interacting with our internal energy, and our internal energy is reacting with our external energy. It's this constant cycle. And so, if we're feeling anxious, we're going to resonate with the anxious experiences. It's not that they're any more or less prevalent because we're anxious. It's that we're better at finding them. We're just tuned to that frequency. And so there's not a question of blame or shame or right or wrong. There's no right way to do any of this. There's no right way to do life. You just live it. And you recognize that you have that ability to tune yourself to what you want to experience. And I was talking with a friend of mine the other day, and she was talking about similar to what you were saying of like, at what point do we get to be done? Was her question. Like, at what point are we done healing? And it's like, thinking about this idea that we live in a universe that's reflecting back to us something inside of ourselves. If we believe that we're always going to be healing, that there's got to be something else, if we're looking for something else to heal, you know what the universe is going to give you? Something else to heal. You'll never be done. And it's not this idea that we get to be done, but it's this idea that if we want a trigger, the universe will find one. If we want something big to heal, we'll find something. And so we get to choose what we want our life experience to be. We get to choose what we want to be tuned to, what frequency we want to see. Again, not because we're causing it, not because it's our fault, not because of any of those things, but simply because we're on this cycle that includes our internal reality and our external reality. We are constantly cycling and interacting with life around us because we are life. And so the life that we have in us is going to be reflected in the life that we have outside of us. And we can't control what's happening outside of us, right? We can't choose what happens next out here, but we do have some say over what happens in here. And we do get to choose what we believe, what we're looking for, how we're feeling, how we're interacting with those feelings. We get to choose what frequency we're tuned to. And so there does come a point where you can say, no, it does get to be easy. It is okay to have those feelings and still be okay. It's okay to be anxious sometimes and still believe that I'm healed and still believe that I'm enough, right? And so that's where we look at what are your tuning forks? What are those things that are going to bring you back into alignment with that energy? For me, I have a book that I love. It's The Power of Positive Energy by Tanaz Chubb. And it's one of the most basic spiritual books I've ever read. But you can just tell that when this woman wrote it, she was flying high. She was completely aligned. Like she was in her highest power, and that energy comes through. And so now when I'm having a hard day, I reread that book. Not because it's anything I don't know, but because it's my personal tuning fork that gets me back in that energy. There are a couple books that I have like that. Or whether it's finding, your unlimited belief. We've talked a lot about limited beliefs. I'm not enough. What's the unlimited one? I'm more than enough. I'm incredibly worthy. Whatever it is for you. Maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's a song, whatever it is, but what's your tuning fork? Because it's not It's not a question of, is it your fault? It's a question of, it's your responsibility. You're going to be interacting with this cycle of internal and external, whether you're aware of it or not. But now that you are aware of it, now that you understand that, you know what, I want to choose differently. I want to feel differently. I don't want my anxiety to rule my life. I can go through these processes that we've talked about on this podcast today, and I can get to a point where I can say, no, I want to choose differently. I want to be attuned to something else. I want to be attuned to divine inspiration and alignment and joy and expansion and all of these things. And I can find whatever it is today that's going to bring my frequency up just a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, so that eventually, you know, it might not be that you're having a panic attack one minute and the next minute you're like the most aligned you've ever been in your life. It might be that you're having a panic attack one minute and the next minute you're just kind of okay. And that's huge. That's a huge energetic shift. That's amazing and incredible. And it opens the door for the next minute, maybe you're a little more okay. And the next day, you're a little more okay. And the next month, actually, you're just okay. And eventually you look back and it's like, those ripples don't become as big. It's not you're absolutely wonderful or you're absolutely terrible. It's your baseline is I'm good. And there's little ripples in the pond. And that's the process, right? It's not an overnight thing. It's not a predetermined thing of like, well, you're either going to be anxious or you're not. It's you have options and you get to choose to realign yourself a little bit and a little bit and a little bit in every moment with what you want to be experiencing. Whether that's a book that just, bam, puts you right back in complete spiritual alignment, or it's a cup of tea that makes you feel not as shitty. You know, it's like, what is your tuning fork in this moment that's going to help you feel even just a tiny bit better? Because that tiny bit is a big deal and it completely shifts that cycle of internal and external that we're all experiencing in each moment. And that's enough. That little shift is more than enough.
And I think that's where we get to recognize that we have a choice. And I think it so much comes down to that recognition that we have a choice. We can keep doing what we've done in the past and feel like crap, or I can make these tiny adjustments. I can make a decision to do something different, to align myself, to feel into the frequency of something that's a little bit more in alignment, like a little bit easier, a little bit more in flow, a little bit more in tune with love than before. And so, for example, like it can be something easy. Like the fastest, easiest way for me to change my energy is to go sit with a bunch of baby goats. Your energy cannot stay shitty if you're sitting with a bunch of baby goats, because they're going to crawl all over you and they're going to try to eat your hair and they're going to try to nurse on your fingers and you're just going to end up laughing about it. So it's like, it doesn't have to be hard. I think that's so often we think that should change to take responsibility for energy. It has to be hard. And for me, it's like nothing more than like I'm deleting all the apps on my freaking phone and I'm only going to listen to this audiobook or podcast. It's going to uplift me. And I'm just going to flood my brain, my mind, the one that's like really wants to hold on to the anxiety with all of these positive messages. I just need to hear it. For me, it's got to be auditory. Whereas Isabel, she's reading something that's bringing that energy in. So whatever works for you, I think that's a huge thing. Like, how can we recognize what's going to be the shift and know that we're worthy of the shift? And if you came onto this podcast, if you came onto this coffee conversation thinking, I thought we are going to be talking about shamanic stuff. Guess what we have? Like, believe it or not, all of this ties back to shamanic understanding and the fact that the past is where we have all these energetic cords. Those energetic cords is what keeps us in those patterns, because those energetic cords are binding us. They're holding us still and stagnant. And so the past can be an energetic cord, and all we have to go is say, I'm no longer available for that. I release and forgive this. And we start cutting those cords away as we look towards the future, and we cast out these new like threads, if you will, into the future that's going to pull us forward. Right. And so all of this conversation actually can tie back into shamanic understanding. We just have to put that lens up of going, okay, how do I see this through energetic cords? How can I see this through my support team? How can I see this through a higher understanding? And knowing that our true divine nature, our true divine self is fully supported. And when we have this understanding, like I am fully supported, my spirit team, whether that is compromised of power animals, gods and goddesses, with spirit guides, with Reiki teachers, whoever it is in your team, like going, yeah, guess what? I'm open and available for divine intervention. And so we start using phrases and setting intentions for our practices. And when we have our 3 breaths, saying thank you for showing up for me, thank you to my spirit team for showing up for me, to recognize that I needed to take those 3 breaths, and giving it back to creator, giving, like, always coming back to this place of I'm of divine nature, and so is everything around me. How has my home taken on the energetic vibration of less than? Right? Like if my home is in an energetic vibration of not feeling worthy, guess what? My house is going to start falling apart. I'm going to have plumbing issues. I'm going to, like, these things are going to start showing up in my external reality as a reflection of the stuff I need to work on. Right? So we need to come back to, like, how can I heal myself, and how can I love everything, every stick of furniture, every piece of nature, your plants in your house? How can you say, I love it? Like, I know that when my plants are drooping, I need to do more self-care. I need to nourish myself as I nourish my plants, right? So I just kind of want to throw that out there. Like, this may have felt very much like a spiritual conversation about anxiety, but it also, we can reflect it back to those shamanic ties as well.
And we can look at that connection of the shaman's truth, that everything is energy, that we are all one, that we are connected, that there's no separation and there's no difference, both in, like Christina's saying, between us and our home, us and the person we're talking to, us and the water we're drinking. There's no separation. We are nature. And that also applies to time, right? There is no past, there is no future, there's just now. And when we are present, when we are standing tall and rooted with the trees, and we're reaching up to the heavens and the sun and the stars and the sky, and we're letting nature just exist with us, and we're recognizing our nature as nature, to just exist, to just be, there is no anxiety in that place. There is no worry. There is no wound. There is no fear. There is just the truth that you are enough, that you are healed, that you are whole. And I think anybody who's, whether you've been on a shamanic journey and you've experienced that state of what shamans call ecstasy, or you've gone really deep into meditation, or you've had a really beautiful Reiki experience, and you've dropped so deeply into the present moment that you touch on that deep, deep knowing of, it's okay, I'm okay, everything is okay when we're present, is another shamanic perspective of looking at anxiety. This idea that there is no separation, there is no anxiety. That's an illusion. It's a projection. It's something that's not real, that we can work through, even though it feels real, right? That's the power of an illusion. We can work through it. We can come back to our understanding of who we truly are, our connection with nature, our ability to exist, and step into that and rest in that, and know that at the end of the day, whether you're looking at it from a shamanic perspective or a spiritual perspective or a psychological perspective, it's all about finding what lens works for you. What perspective on anxiety allows you to take a step forward, to do something different, to feel a little bit better, and what works for you without comparing that to anybody else, finding your pathway through anxiety and trusting that if it helps, then it's meant for you. Then it's okay. Then you can choose that lens, you can choose that role, you can choose that pathway, so long as it's a conscious choice, that you know that you're choosing it for yourself. You're choosing to help yourself move forward, to help yourself choose a different way of seeing reality that gets you out of that cycle. And that, at the end of the day, is really what we're talking about with anxiety, of letting yourself have the permission and power to choose something different. Because if what you were doing, if what you had been doing was going to work, it would have worked by now. And I think that's a really hard truth to come to terms with when you have anxiety, of letting your brain know, if your way of dealing with this was going to work, we wouldn't still be here. And that's okay, right? It's okay that our brain wants to try the same thing over and over and over again. And it's okay to be able to say, the fact that it hasn't worked yet means there's a different choice. It means I have a different option. It means I have the opportunity to come back into my nature, to come back into the present, to connect with the spiritual, shamanic, or psychological lens that's going to help me understand that I have a choice to be free. I can choose differently. I can choose something that's going to help me realign with who I truly am and where I truly want to go. And that's okay. And that's enough. And I have the power to make that choice.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting. And the fact that when we start making these new choices, the synchronicity and the surprise is what it feels like. I remember making a big choice, and I don't think my spirit team was ready for it. They were like, oh, wow, she did the thing. She did the thing. Okay, she's paying attention now. Let's just flood her with all of the intercessions and the synchronicities and the signs. And it was just like I put them on their toes, and so I want to invite you to do that too. Like, what would be your grandest, most divine orientation of action? Can you do one thing that's like, yeah, it's going to be freaking scary, but when you just say yes to it and you dive in, it's amazing how our spirit teams are like, oh yeah, okay, she's paying attention now. Let's make this so easy because she's in alignment, right? And so the more often I can take those big leaps, the better my life feels, right? Yeah, I still have those moments of like anxiety, and what has happened over the years is it becomes easier and easier and easier to get out of those slumps and to make a new choice. And so I'm going to invite you to do that as well. Recognizing what's your activity to help you get into alignment, to get into that higher frequency, and what can you do today to recognize your higher self's voice. What message do they have for you? How can you give it a chance to show up in your life today?
Beautiful. Beautiful. So we would love to hear your answers to that question, to this permission slip, if you will, of just for today. Call out to our Reiki principles. Just for today, can you try one thing that's going to realign you with your truth? One thing that your higher self is calling you to do. And let us know what that is over in the Reiki Cafe community. We would love to hear the choice that you make and how you feel after. We would also love to hear your top takeaways from today. Did you get a new tip or technique for working through anxiety that you didn't have before? Do you have a new way of viewing your anxiety? Did you get an aha moment? Let us know. We would love to hear them. And as always, thank you all so, so much for joining with us, for tuning in, for saying yes to you by opening up to the possibility that there's another way of viewing and working through your anxiety. And know that, just like we were saying, Reiki Cafe community is your space to stay uplifted and to stay aligned and to come back into connection with who you truly are. So feel free to join us over in our Facebook group. Send us a message on Facebook if you want to chat and connect. And thank you, as always, for joining with us today.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.